system is still a functioning part of Melbourne's water supply network, but it now only accounts for a very small percentage of the supply for a much bigger modern city, having largely been superseded by much larger systems more recently. So if we go on to the next slide. So Turarong Reservoir was constructed in the 1880s, 1886 specifically, as part of a major extension of the Anyun system. And the purpose of Turarong was to divert clean water from creeks further to the north into an aqueduct. And that aqueduct was known as the Clearwater Channel because of the clean nature of the water that it was transferring. And that ran into the Anyun Reservoir, which you've seen was then feeding water down into Melbourne. The quantity and quality of the water that Melbourne was receiving was thus dramatically improved because of this cleaner water from further outside the city. As at Anyun, a park was created around the reservoir. It was established with stone-lined pathways. You can see here some of those things, mixture of native and exotic trees. This is the earthen down wall of the reservoir. And then this is the beginning of what I refer to as the Clearwater, what's known as the Clearwater Channel. So that's the aqueduct that took the water down to Anyun Reservoir. And the park environment around the reservoir became a quite popular tourist attraction. This was quite common to the reservoirs in the time. They often became tourist attractions and places of recreation. If I then go on to this slide, shows a plan from the Conservation Management Plan for the Anyun system, which was prepared in 2007. Now, the inset here shows in a bit more clearly where Turarong Reservoir is. So the Anyun Reservoir is this reservoir here. And the larger map shows in 2007 the facilities and features that were at the Turarong Reservoir Park, recreational facilities, and you can perhaps see here that there's a platypus hide, so a place for watching platypuses, which is a particularly interesting animal that is native to Australia. I'll show you a picture in a minute if you're not familiar with that species. And it was actually the location where the Australian Platypus Conservancy was based, to give you an idea of the presence of platypuses there. This next slide, so I'm going to be talking in terms of various levels of heritage listing, and this slide shows you the different levels of listing that apply in the state of Victoria. So the main, I suppose what we would refer to, well, what I will refer to in several instances in this presentation is the state level register or listing, which is the Victorian Heritage Register, or VHR. And that's supported by the Victorian Heritage Act. This slide, unfortunately, is actually out of date. It's been reviewed since 1995, and now the Victorian Heritage Act is 2017. But you can see that there are more local listings, what's known as the Heritage Overlay, which is supported by a different Victorian Act. Then above the state heritage listings is the National Heritage List, and then, of course, the World Heritage List. And both of those lists are supported by the federal, or we in Australia refer to as Commonwealth, level act, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act. Now, the Anyun system, including Turarong, was recommended for inclusion on the State Heritage Register in 2007, but it wasn't actually included on the register until 6 years later, 2013. Turarong itself was added individually to the register in 2010, before the listing of the whole system, 3 years before the whole system was listed. Now, if we go along, this is just to illustrate the process that is gone through when adding places to the Victorian Heritage Register. This is a series of criteria that the Victorian Heritage Council uses to assess places for inclusion on that register. So these criteria cover the whole range of characteristics of cultural heritage places. So we're talking the role in Victoria's history, whether they represent uncommon, rare, or endangered aspects of that history, the potential to yield additional information. That's really a question of archaeology. Importance in demonstrating principal characteristics. Their importance in exhibiting aesthetic characteristics of significance. Their importance in demonstrating a high degree of technical achievement. Strong or special associations with communities. So this is often just referred to as social value or spiritual value. and special associations with significant individuals or groups of individuals. And if you were to look, I mean, this final column just demonstrates that actually the Yanyin system as a whole satisfies all of these criteria, which is not really surprising considering its prominence as the earliest water supply system for Melbourne, its size and its complexity. But the thing I want to raise here is that none of these criteria relates to natural heritage. So they're all specifically relating to cultural heritage. And of course, the main purpose of these criteria is to achieve protection and conservation of cultural heritage places and objects. But it's important to recognize that restriction. And I'll come back to that a bit later when I talk about the national listings. So many of you will be familiar with the Borough Charter, I certainly hope. Its full name is the Australia ICOMOS Charter for the Conservation of Places of Cultural Significance. And the Charter defines cultural heritage management practice across Australia. And it's been translated for use across the world. When I was the president of Australia ICOMOS, I signed up on, I think, a Swedish translation and a Lithuanian translation. But it's been translated into Chinese, French, Spanish, all the languages of ICOMOS. But even though the Charter is focused primarily on the conservation of cultural heritage, it is careful to assert that conservation of a place should identify and take into consideration all aspects of cultural and natural significance without unwarranted emphasis on any one value at the expense of others. The question is, how do we ensure that that's the case? And are we equipped as cultural heritage professionals to manage all of these values in a holistic way? So returning to the Taurong example, the conservation management plan for the Yanyin system does recognize that very significant natural values exist in the area and the area through which the system passes. In particular, these include old growth forests, and of particular relevance to the study around the case study of Taurong is, as I mentioned, the platypus habitat. And this down here in the corner, if you're not familiar with the platypus, is the platypus. Very strange animal. It's a mammal, but it lays eggs. Look it up if you're interested. However, going back to the natural values, these values are listed in the conservation management plan for the Yanyin system, but the Yanyin CMP, the conservation management plan, does not provide any management policy relating to these values. This means that whilst there are other mechanisms within the area under various other legislation to protect the natural heritage of that area, the managers of the historic water supply system do not have guidance to manage the natural heritage values of the system that include these old growth forests and the various species that exist in and around the system. So moving on to the next slide, this illustrates, moving on from what I was talking about in relation to state heritage listing. So this central row relates to that state level of listing. And then, sorry, confusingly, I've got them the other way around from the slide I had before, but local level of heritage designation is achieved through the Planning Environment Act. And that's the case for both cultural heritage, if you sort of follow these two columns here, but also natural heritage. Now, when we talk about state level, there is a division. So cultural heritage, and I'm just talking about non-Aboriginal or historical heritage here, is covered by the Heritage Act of 2017, which is administered by Heritage Victoria. But natural heritage is covered by two separate acts and managed by two separate sections of the Victorian government. Now, this isn't, and then when we get to the national level, actually, I've just talked about this at the local level. Whilst it would appear to be the case that at the local level, councils would be managing both cultural heritage and natural heritage, in reality, it's very different departments within those councils that are managing those two different sets of heritage. And often they don't talk to each other very much. And so they're managed quite separately. Now, at the national level, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, EPBC Act, does bring together historic, as I've referred to, Indigenous or Aboriginal heritage and natural heritage all together into one national heritage list. And it does this by using similar criteria to the state level heritage list, but with an expanded focus. So for example, criterion A of the state heritage criteria relates to importance to the course or pattern of Victoria's cultural history. Whereas for the National Heritage List, the same criterion A, so it deals with the same stuff, but it relates to heritage value to the nation because of the place's importance in the course or pattern of Australia's natural or cultural history. So it's expanded to encompass both natural and cultural heritage. Now, when it comes to the World Heritage List, which isn't on this slide, many of you will be aware that under the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, there are 10 selection criteria. 6 of them are broadly orientated towards cultural heritage, and 4 are broadly orientated towards natural heritage. World Heritage in Australia is managed under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, but by the same Commonwealth Department, the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. But the sections responsible for cultural and natural heritage are very different and quite separated. Now, this can result in very serious imbalances in resourcing in particular. So a good example would be following recent bushfires in the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, a very large amount of resources was directed to evaluating the impacts on natural heritage, but much less was directed to evaluating the impacts on cultural heritage. And now the division in heritage practice is not just about these acts and the agencies that manage them. It's also about the way we're trained as professionals and the way our disciplines are organized. You know, archaeologists and heritage architects on the one side and biologists and biodiversity specialists on the other. But that's a whole separate presentation, so I won't go there right now. But talking of fires, if we go back to Tauranga, the separation of management of cultural and natural heritage was really brought to the fore by a major bushfire in early 2009 that was known as the Black Saturday bushfires. And the fact that these fires also very unfortunately resulted in a high number of casualties in local communities brings home to us the very important point that when we're talking about heritage values, both cultural and natural, we also have to consider that it's the communities that hold those values, and how they feature in the priorities of those communities is a very important question. Sometimes natural values are considered more important, sometimes cultural values. Now, returning to the physical site, you can see that the reservoir park at Tauranga was completely burnt. So all the structures and facilities were destroyed, and most of the surrounding forest was also burnt out. Now, this was a fundamental problem in terms of the operation of the reservoir, because it was quickly realized that siltation into the reservoir was increasing because of the loss of vegetation. So runoff into the reservoir was bringing a lot of silt, and there was a very high risk that the dam would fail. So substantial works were undertaken to expand the dam, the priority being maintenance of health and safety, but also water supply. And here are some images from some of the conservation works that were undertaken during that expansion. So here's in the top left is what the spillway of the reservoir looked like before they started the works. And then we did a whole lot of recording, laser scanning of the various different significant heritage structures. This is the outlet into the Clearwater Channel that I mentioned. This is an image of a grab on a large excavator taking apart the stones. Here are some of the stones labeled and palleted. I was the monitoring archaeologist on site, and it was like playing with an enormous Lego set. It was fantastic. This is the new spillway put back together again. And this is the outlet structure, which is shown in this image up here, having been dismantled, reassembled, and then the dam was expanded and the outlet structure was rebuilt again 10 meters downstream. But it's important to recognize that there were very negative effects. Sorry, I've jumped forward on a slide. There were very negative effects on the natural values of the site as well. For example, platypuses haven't been seen since the bushfires in Tauranga Reservoir, and that was, over 2009, so that was over a decade ago. But importantly, there was no equivalent conservation process for natural values. So, for whatever reason, the cultural values of this site were prioritized, and the conservation works were undertaken on the heritage infrastructure and not necessarily in relation to the natural values. So if we go on to a second example, this is the Tauranga system, which, as I said, is on the River Murray, which is at the northern edge of the state of Victoria. The Turrumbary irrigation system was begun, as a small-scale local system by local farmers, and then later it was expanded, and a series of new acts enabled it to be expanded and consolidated. And then finally, the Turrumbary Weir, which is down here in the bottom corner, was constructed. And what that was enabled to be done was that it raised the water, so that the river is actually flowing from the bottom right to the top left of this image. And the Turrumbary Weir held the water back to the point where the water level was able to feed this large irrigation system. And that's the green line here going through here. So it goes through this series of lakes, through these, what are called swamps, all the way through here. And then it comes back into the river. So it's what's known as an anabranch system, which means the water leaves the river and then passes through the system before returning back to the river. And that essentially means that it's part of the river system. So it has very high natural values as part of the Murray River system. And a key characteristic of the system, if we go on to this next slide, is that it has made expansive use of natural features. So natural streams, watercourses, and lakes. And it's done this at a level of complexity which has not been seen in other areas of Victoria and probably Australia. The system was nominated for inclusion on the Victorian Heritage Register, that state level register, in 2014. But the nomination for its inclusion is still on hold now. And this is partly because there is no broader thematic study that's been done to understand, to provide a framework to understand how these natural and cultural features work together and what the wider context is for their significance. And so there's no, if you like, comparison to enable the significance of this place and therefore whether it should be listed to be determined. So that means that it has not been added to the Heritage Register, but some of the elements within it have been. So some of the built infrastructure, like the Turrumbary Weir, that element that's actually on the river, have been added to the list. And you wonder whether, in that circumstance, a focus more on process and the passage of water itself would produce a different outcome, would enable us to think about the system holistically. Now, the system of the Turrumbary system, as part of that broader River Murray system, has very high natural values, particularly as a wildlife refuge and a breeding ground for Murray cod in particular. The scheme is continually evolving, so there's the question of continuing supply, continuing as a functional system. And so we're in a situation where questions are asked of the cultural heritage of the place, the historical heritage in particular, and of the natural heritage. And we're now in a situation where we begin to wonder whether or not the two are compatible to achieve the same goals. And the reason I say that is that if we look at, for example, there's what's called a native fish recovery plan has been prepared for the system. And this plan identifies as a key challenge balancing ecological outcome with water use for irrigation and recreation. But there's no consideration within that, if you like, natural heritage plan about cultural heritage. It does consider Aboriginal cultural heritage, and before I mentioned the distinction, but there's no recognition of the historical value or the historical heritage of the system, of those weirs and those channels and those outlets. And the philosophy behind the plan, the fish recovery plan, is that it returned the ecosystem to as close to the natural system, but that they can still use the irrigation system to achieve these goals of returning the natural values to the area. But even doing that, it doesn't recognize the historical origin of that system. So we have a disconnect. So if we go on now to just a slight detour to another site in Melbourne, as it happens, but similar situation to Turrumbary, Dights Falls, which is in the north of the city centre in Melbourne, is on the Yarra River, the Birrarung River, to give it its Aboriginal name. And on that river, a weir was built to replace a natural rockfall in the 1840s, and that weir fed a race that powered a mill for grinding flour. And the weir was added to the the Victorian Heritage Register back in the 90s, I think. But the weir then fell into very poor condition, and because it was deemed liable to fail, it had to be removed. And at the same time, there was a need to try to restore the natural values in returning the ability for migratory fish to swim up the river, and therefore, enter more of the river system. So the weir was removed completely, and again, I was the monitoring archaeologist pulling these piles out of the river, and it was replaced. The replacement included what's known as a vertical slot fishway, which is a method or a route through which fish can navigate past the weir. And so this is a situation which is likely to occur at Turrumbary in some respect, where cultural heritage, the historical heritage of the place, will be superseded by the need to maintain natural values. But what's been done here is that interpretation has been used to convey all those values. So here in the bottom right-hand corner is an interpretation panel that talks about the Aboriginal significance of the place to the local Wurundjeri people. But they've also installed, these are a couple of the wooden piles from the historical weir that was removed. And so, you can use interpretation to convey all these values in the same place, even if the actual fabric is changing. So now we'll go on to my third case study. So Mini Ponds Creek, this is a fairly low resolution, but hopefully a more useful plan of where the creek runs. So Melbourne is down here. That's actually the very center of Melbourne, but the city of Melbourne is really sort of here. And the creek runs down, and then it joins what's labeled here as the Yarra River, and then goes into Port Phillip Bay. Now, the creek would have been and was, we know, a focus of activity for Aboriginal people. And after colonization, as the land was sold to European colonists, it quickly became built up, and then it started to receive pollution from residential use, from nearby noxious industries, things like tanneries and abattoirs, and slowly it became very polluted. And then it was widened so that it could carry barges for carrying coal to the local railway network. And then in the 1950s and 1960s, it was very substantially realigned, and parts of it were concreted to prevent flooding. And for much of its length through the suburbs now, it is essentially a very large storm drain. Although elsewhere, further north, further upstream, it retains more of its natural form. Now, the creek itself isn't heritage listed, but it does contain a number of places which are, or within the compound or the area of the creek, and its environs and the creek itself are certainly of historical and technical and aesthetic and social significance, to go back to those criteria. So perhaps it will be at some point. This is just a series of images that show you those transitions as we go along the creek. So the southernmost areas is just essentially it's just a huge storm drain here and here, and then you can begin to see where it's slightly more natural landscape here, and then by the time you get further north, this is still largely altered, but it still retains quite a lot of the natural values, the vegetation, the species that would have, even in an urban environment, but would have continued to be there since colonization. And this slide, apologies for the orientation, but north is to the right of the picture and south is to the left. So here on this left side is where the creek enters the Yarra River, and so it's running through here, and all the way up here you can see the bends there. So essentially this is the catchment, but the point of this slide is to illustrate how built up the lower reaches of the creek are. So it's very urbanized down here, and then it gets more agricultural up here. And you can probably see here that there are some very major transport routes, railway lines, freeways running in and around, or over and around the creek down here, and that's all added to the pollution and the need to turn it into this man-made channel, essentially. So This slide shows a chronology for Mooney Ponds Creek. So it's described here as a living creek, a natural creek. And then in the 1850s, it becomes an agricultural creek in that it was used mostly for draining agricultural areas and irrigating natural agricultural areas. Then it starts to become polluted, and here it's referred to as a sewer creek. And then a drainage creek, because it was altered to amend or to improve the drainage of the area, and an urbanized creek, and also a recreation creek, because as the area became built up, it became a focus for people going on walks, walking their dogs, going for a cycle, just a transport link. But now this chronology is taken from a planning document that's been prepared by a coalition or a collaboration of organizations known as the Chain of Ponds Collaboration. And that includes local, state government, community groups and advisory bodies. And their purpose of this collaboration is to progressively transform Mooney Ponds Creek to provide environmental and social benefits for the community. And they've produced this document that is essentially setting out a vision for that. And I'm just going to show you some of the extracts from that report to illustrate the historical development of the creek and the processes, the thought processes that they're going through in trying to achieve this transformation. Please don't feel that you need to read everything that's on the slide. I'm just going to zoom into some of the pictures to illustrate the transformation. So this slide is, as I say, is from this planning document, but it refers to, as you can see, it's an agricultural creek. And here we are, there's some of the images of its use for agriculture. They're not very good photos, unfortunately, but you can see early settlement. You can see, this is a sort of pastoral landscape in the upper reaches of the creek, and I believe this is Melbourne, or the early settlement of Melbourne in the distance. If we go on to the next slide, a sewer creek now. So here we are. This is the very degraded landscape of the creek as agricultural overuse has started to erode its sides. Here are pictures of the way that the creek has become, used as a repository for waste, and it's very eroded and degraded, and you can see that there's not very much vegetation. Then a drainage creek. So here are these images of the flooding, and then here is the sort of the engineering that was installed to turn it into this drainage system. And you can see that this is one of these these wide concreted conduits in flood. Now, this is a bit more positive. A recreation creek. So these are photos to illustrate some of the uses. That's just in the area, but some of the uses in the area and the functions that the creek played, because it is still quite an attractive landscape, and there are a number of parks and reserves along the creek. So it has an amenity value for the local population, and an urbanized creek. So here is sort of illustrating the way that the area has become developed. This is the CityLink motorway that is the main western route out of Melbourne. This is some of the urban development occurring in the 1950s and 60s. Then we get to a more modern and contemporary recognition of the environmental importance of the creek. So these are photos of community groups. They're replanting using indigenous species. They're gathering litter. They're restoring the banks of the creeks. They're creating new reserves and publicizing it. And so I think, and then I think there's one more. Yeah, this is what they're referring to. The collaboration, the Chain of Ponds collaboration, is referring to as the future creek. So as you can see, they're trying to return the creek to something like its natural state, to try and return some of those natural values to the place. So what I've been involved in of late in relation to this this initiative is consultation with the Aboriginal traditional owners of the area. And this has been helping the collaboration, and in particular, the agency known as Melbourne Water, who are one of the lead partners, to better understand the Aboriginal cultural values of the creek. And incidentally, Melbourne Water are also the managers of the Yanyin system, of which Tarumbari is a part that we talked about in the first case study. And in comparing the Moonee Ponds situation, the Moonee Ponds Creek project, with the works that were undertaken at Turarong a decade ago, Melbourne Water's managers, who I've been speaking to on the subject, they now speak of taking a much more landscape approach, which takes into account historical, Aboriginal and natural values, rather than that focus on heritage fabric, historical heritage fabric that characterized the works at Turarong. So this image shows consultation meetings and site visits that were undertaken with elders and support staff from the Wurundjeri, who are the local, it's through their traditional country that Moonee Ponds Creek passes. And this process included talking about the tangible heritage, but also its intangible associations and stories that the Aboriginal community hold about the watercourse. The creek is a focus of Aboriginal cultural sites. In fact, this photo on the left shows us finding a new artifact scatter during one of the site visits and recording it. But discussion also covered aspects of the natural environment that are of significance to the Wurundjeri. So these included the indigenous vegetation, some of which was being reintroduced in the slides that I just showed, and restoring water quality to enable the return of species to the creek, such as river blackfish, crayfish, or yabbies in Australian vernacular, and eels. It also included discussion of the correct geology of rocks to be used in the creek in an effort to restore the natural water flow. So the plan is to introduce rocks to create more of a curvilinear route rather than the straight flow that the drainage system has created, because it's more conducive to renaturalization and slowing of the water. And I was introduced to the concept of a rock weed, by which the Wurundjeri mean a geology that does not belong in that location. So instead of rock being imported from somewhere else, the Wurundjeri were very keen to ensure that the geology, the rocks that were imported, came from other locations in Wurundjeri country, which is very much characterized by volcanic basalt geology. So some of the aspects of significance as far as the Wurundjeri and the Aboriginal traditional owners are concerned, some of the key points around the management of water systems in relation to both cultural and natural heritage are, well, firstly, waterways are highly significant as the source of important resources that were traditionally used by Aboriginal people and as the focus of long traditions of cultural practice. But quite key to what we're talking about now is that the Aboriginal view of watercourses is that they are conduits or links. They are channel, they are a focus. They are not a barrier. Unfortunately, in the sort of Western European way of managing land is that we use watercourses as the boundaries, as with the Murray River, that I showed you before in relation to the Tarumbari system. Whereas really they are focal points. And Aboriginal people assert that water is connected to both cultural and natural well-being, and the two are indivisible. They cannot be separated, and so they need to be managed together. And this Aboriginal perspective on management is paralleling or probably influencing the latest thinking around the management of these systems by the councils and by organisations like Melbourne Water, who now talk of approaching the renewal works in the creek, for example, from a perspective of livability as a wellness as a whole, in which the conservation and restoration of both cultural and natural values are both important. And so they're looking at managing landscape rather than just individual heritage places. Now, finally, I can just come to this last slide, which draws some conclusions from everything that I've just been talking about. So the separation of legislation, management frameworks, and professional practice in Australia, as likely in many other places around the world, makes holistic management of cultural and natural values difficult. There's a separation built into our systems. And these difficulties are increased when water management and the function of the systems needs to be continued. There are priorities at play, and sometimes those priorities will fall on cultural heritage, sometimes they'll fall on natural heritage. We need to create a system in which they are seen together and prioritized together. The Borough Charter and other guidance rightly encourage us to address all these heritage values together. So that's the challenge. What do we have in terms of tools? Well, interpretation is an invaluable tool that helps us to reflect many layers of value that a place may have. And Indigenous perspectives help us to see beyond the division that we've created and to approach management in a much different and holistic way. Perhaps the consideration of the heritage significance of the water and the process of the transfer of the water is a way to approach this challenge, rather than focusing on individual points, individual bits of fabric along the route of that water, and maybe individually of cultural or natural heritage significance. And this is an area in which the new ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Water and Heritage is hoping to be able to focus attention and explore, and then to work with some of the world's water management organizations to achieve some real gains in terms of the management of water systems, at least. So that's where I'll stop. I'll just stop sharing. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for your excellent presentation. Indeed. 我们谢谢 Ian 的发表哈。那我想
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Do we have questions that have been submitted online? We will now open the floor for questions. You can either submit questions online or you can raise questions by simply putting up your hands. I would like to be the first one to raise questions. As far as I understand, Australia's heritage system is different from that in Taiwan. The Cultural Water and Environment Department or Ministry in Australia manages natural heritage, meaning the cultural heritage and natural heritage at the federal level are managed by the same agency. However, there are different territories and provinces. You have the New South Wales, you have Victorian, the different states have their own legislation system. When there is such a difference between the federal legislation and the local legislation or the state level legislation, then it causes difficulties at the local level. You have raised a very important point, which is the Bura Charter, which is the guiding principle. That is not just of tremendous value in Australia, but to the rest of the world. It looks like the significance, holistic value of heritage. 3 steps: understand the value, making reasonable use, and holistic management of the heritage. These are 3 very important approaches or steps. They are simple, easy to understand, and executable. So the Bura Charter is of great importance, especially for professional practitioners, when we think about how to manage the heritage, whether it's cultural or natural. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for drawing our attention to the Bura Charter. Another point I would like to make is that in Ian's presentation, he talked about making meaningful connections between cultural and natural heritage. This has been such a topical issue. Natural biodiversity or natural aesthetics. There are no fixed standards. Who has the right to decide? Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. It is really dependent upon very personalized determination. So in this context, when we seek to understand or comprehend cultural and natural heritage, in addition to the indigenous First Nation people's perspectives, this is the general direction we would like to go for. So thank you, Ian, very much for showing the 3 case studies to illustrate your points. So finally, I would like to perhaps give Ian a little bit time to. We understand that in 2020, e-commerce General Assembly was not able to be held in Australia. It was quite a pity. We know that in 2023, Australia will host the e-commerce General Assembly, and the scientific committee will focus on heritage change. I think the theme has been determined. So maybe, Ian, you could talk to us about this upcoming conference, market it, and advertise this General Assembly, maybe briefly touch about the themes and its significance. Ian, please turn on your microphone.
It was very disappointing when we had to cancel. And yes, as you say, we've revisited. I am on the organising committee for the General Assembly, but I'm not one of those who are developing the themes. So I don't feel in a position to be able to talk much about where the themes are going to be going. But the heritage of change or the subject of change, I think, is something that we just have to confront in everything, in this new world. And the way the subjects I've just been talking about are really about how the structures we have to manage cultural heritage and natural heritage are currently not speaking to one another, and therefore they're not doing the job we need them to do. It's almost a metaphor for many other systems in the way the world works at the moment. But I think in speaking from the position of the International Scientific Committee on Water and Heritage, we certainly see this topic of the General Assembly will be pushing to be an opportunity for some structural change in the way that we operate, in that we're looking to collaborate much more with other organizations who may not realize on the surface that they are managing cultural heritage, but are making a bigger difference for cultural heritage than often organizations which are established to manage cultural heritage. So an example would be bodies that manage large-scale water systems, and people like the International Water Council or the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage, who have responsibilities in these areas, but they're not directly thinking about them. But in collaboration with those organizations, so changing in that respect, we can achieve much greater accomplishments, I think, in what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. 好，我们知道伊恩他等。
We understand that Ian has a meeting to attend. However, he will return and join the final panel discussion. We would like to thank him for joining us today. Thank you. Now, we would like to invite the next speaker. The next speaker would be Professor Evstathio. Evstathio from the Cyprus University of Technology. Hi. Good morning, Professor.
It's clear.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we could hear you. Yes.
Hello. Yes. Okay.
Yes, hello.
Okay. I'm your chair. I'm Alex. Nice to see you.
Nice.
塞浦路斯科技大学呢，好，它简称 CUT。
The Cyprus University of Technology, its acronym is CUT, and it's very similar to the acronym of the university where I teach, the China University of Technology. So it's a nice coincidence. And the Cyprus University of Technology is a part of the UNESCO Chair Program. And UNESCO has been setting up chair programs around prestigious universities around the world. And Professor Evstathio is currently an UNESCO chair on digital cultural heritage. This means that the conservation is enabled by the use of digital measures and technologies. So it's quite an honor for us to have Professor Evstathio to share his expertise and knowledge with us at today's international conference. So, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome Professor Evstathio as he delivers a very important presentation. He will talk about a very important an instrument that dates back to 2,000 years ago, the very first analog computer or calculator in the world. That is an important historic artifact of significant cultural and technological importance. And the professor and his team has done tremendously important research into this instrument. So without further ado, I would like to turn the program over to Professor Evstathio.
Thank you for introducing me.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kyriakos Evstathiou. I am the holder of the ERA Chair in Digital Cultural Heritage, the project Mnemosine, in the Cyprus University of Technology. The subject of my presentation is the Antikythera mechanism. But let me first say a few words about the project Mnemosine. The Mnemosine project aims to achieve the following: completion of 6 PhDs in digital cultural heritage, the combination of which will lead to definition and creation of holistic documentation pipelines for specific user communities and creation of standards for 3D documentation and knowledge management in DCH. Also, in the frames of the project, a Center of Excellence in Digital Cultural Heritage will be created. Moreover, an e-learning master course in cultural informatics will be developed. Seminars on issues of DCH will be organized, and cooperations agreements with other research and academia institutions will be established. One of the case studies of the Mnemosine project is the Antikythera mechanism. Before referring the Antikythera mechanism, I would like to introduce you to some historic technological landmarks of ancient Greek, which under the right conditions could be the trigger for the Industrial Revolution many centuries earlier. An Eolipile, also known as a Heros engine, is a simple radial steam turbine which spins when the central water container is heated. Torque is produced by steam jets exciting the turbine. Can you imagine a steam-powered energy source invented nearly 2,000 years ago? That's about 18 centuries before James Watt is credited with inventing the steam engine which sparked the Industrial Revolution. Ctesibius described one of the first force pumps for producing a jet of water or for lifting water from wells. The Ctesibius water pump was a manual pressure pump that used air to increase the water pressure in a two-cylinder system, forcing the water to come out. What Hero's engine could do if we placed, e.g., a pulley with a belt and transferred the motion of the sphere to another arrangement? In this way, mechanical movement would be achieved, thus automating the Ctesibius water pump. Or to give motion to a vehicle, meaning that the Industrial Revolution would have begun 17 centuries earlier. Another interesting object is the Philippi sundial, a portable pocket ring sundial, which encapsulates the scientific spirit and the technological innovation of the Hellenistic epoch. This instrument, in addition to finding the time, was used to find the latitude of a place and to find the azimuth and the height of the sun. But the most important technological landmark of ancient Greece is the Antikythera mechanism, the biggest technological breakthrough of antiquity worldwide. Here, you see the decision to declare the Antikythera mechanism as a historical mechanical engineering landmark by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, engraved on a bronze plate. The Antikythera mechanism is so important for the development of technology as the Parthenon on the evolution of architecture. In the Antikythera mechanism, 2nd century BC technologies are found which shift the history of technology back many centuries. But what was the Antikythera mechanism? The Antikythera mechanism was a technologically amazing analog computer, the first computer in the history. It was constructed about 2,200 years ago. It was used to calculate the motion of the sun, the moon, and probably the planets among the stars. It implemented the astronomical knowledge of ancient Greeks about the motion of these bodies with astonishing accuracy, considering the anomalous orbit of the moon using a system of eccentric gears. The next mechanical calculators are built about 1,500 years later. At the beginning of the 13th century, the astronomical clock of Tonti, and in the 14th century, the Prague astronomical clock, the same complex as the mechanism is. Later, in the 17th century, we are built the calculator of Sicard, Kepler's collaborator, and the Pascaline of the great French scientist. But what could the Antikythera mechanism calculate? The mechanism was used to calculate the exact position of the sun, the moon, and possibly the planets on the sky. It calculated the phases of the moon, predicted eclipses, and indicated the start date of the Pan-Hellenic Games, as for example, the Olympic Games. It contained a manual with detailed instructions. It had front and back doors with astronomical, geographical, and technological inscriptions covering much of the exterior of the mechanism. Similar ancient mechanism has not so far been found. Here we see a replica of the mechanism. The operator, by turning the moon pointer, gives motion to all the gears that in their turn rotated on the front side 2 pointers and on the back side 5 pointers. On the front side, there were 2 concentric circular scales. The outer scale had 365 subdivisions, the days of the year. The inner scale had 360 subdivisions and the names of the 12 zodiac constellations. At the backside of the mechanism were 2 spiral scales. The upper spiral consists of 5 windings, with each total length divided in 235 sections corresponding to the 235 months of Metonic period. On these sections were carved the ancient names of the 12 lunar months and were repeated until all 235 months were completed. The lower back dial is a Saros eclipse predictions dial arranged as a form-turn spiral of 223 lunar months with glyphs indicating eclipse predictions. This is a transparent, educational, and fully functional model of the Antikythera mechanism in scale 3:1 constructed by our team. In the following video, we will see in the front side of the mechanism indications of the pointers of the sun and the moon during the operation of the mechanism. Here we have a new moon. The sphere of the moon is black. And in every position we can see on the zodiac scale where these bodies are. Here we have full moon because the sphere was white. Again, a new moon, and the moon in crescent phase. The operator, by choosing a date, can be seen the astronomical phenomena that occur on that day, or choosing an astronomical phenomenon, see when it will happen. The choice of the day of 15 of June 2011, for example, results the following. At this day, the position of the sun on the sky is the constellation of Twins, and the corresponding position of the moon is the constellation of Sagittarius. At this day, we will have a full moon and possible a lunar eclipse. Whether this happens, we will see it by observing the pointer of the eclipses. Observing the pointer of the eclipses on the backside of the mechanism, we see that indeed at this day we will have a lunar eclipse. In the following slides, we will see technologies of the 2nd century BC, which were found in the Antikythera mechanism. Until the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism, the construction of the first real gears was stated centuries later. The gears of the Antikythera mechanism are the first in the world history. Appius of Alexandria describes several machines that were described by earlier mathematicians and engineers such as Archimedes, Heron of Alexandria, and others, and included gears. We see some of these constructions here. For two gears to work together, they must have the same ratios of diameter to number of teeth. We call this relation module today. In this example described by Bapos, we see that our ancestors knew the module in antiquity. The history of gear technology have been postponed for many centuries. Here, we see metallic axes and shafts of complex geometry found in the mechanism. Their manufacturing, as well as the manufacturing of metal plates like these, machine tools are required. The date scale of the mechanism had the shape of a ring. The ring was removable. Under this date ring, there were 365 holes. Every 4 years, the operator was able to remove the ring and move it one hole to take leap years into account. The tomography of the real object. Here, we see the metonic scale in the form of a spiral consisting of 5 turns. But how is the corresponding pointer of the metonic scale design? Here we see how we reconstructed the pointer and how it works. It follows the spiral exactly like the tip of a record player needle. The pointer of the ellipses dial is exactly the same. A question is arise. Did the Greeks have machine tools and corresponding cutting tools at that time? The text of this inscription from the 4th century BC refers to the construction of bronze axes, polos in Greek, for columns with a lathe. Here we read, a copper alloy from Marion, a city in Cyprus, must be used consisting of 11 parts copper and 1 part tin. We call this alloy bronze today. The parts of the Antikythera mechanism are made of bronze. After that, we read, turn the axis according to the example. For the machining of bronze steel tools are necessary. It follows from several sources that the Greeks at that time had such tools. The Antikythera shipwreck and the discovery of the mechanism. In 75 BC, a large Roman ship paddled with the waves on the Rao Sea between the mainland of Greece and Crete. Finally, the boat sank on the shores of the small Greek island Antikythera. The ship was loaded with works of art and other precious artifacts. 2,000 years later, around the Easter of 19th century AD, spunk divers from Simi by chance discovered the shipwreck. A year later, the Archaeological School of Athens made the first large-scale marine excavation. Here we can see some of the found objects that are in the Archaeological Museum of Athens, like this statue, or the philosopher, or the famous teenager of Antikythera, this glamorous cap, and these earrings. Among the findings was the Antikythera mechanism, which after 2,000 years on the ocean floor was broken, corroded, and petrified to change the knowledge about the technological capabilities of our ancestors that we had until now. Here we see two of the fragments of the mechanism. Here we see the three largest fragments of the mechanism. And here, all the found fragments, technologies and techniques used to decode the mechanism. In September 2005, PDM DOM's innovative digital image capture mechanism, an advanced photography for reading text, made possible the reading of also captured, faded, and worn inscriptions and other details of the surface of the fragments of the Antikythera mechanism. The DOM surrounded the examined fragment and took a series of photographs from 50 different directions to analyze the three-dimensional structure of the surface. This made it possible to examine details of the surface of the fragments, even if they were not visible with the best systems of conventional and digital photography. Another technology used is the X-ray tomography. Here we see the fragment A, the largest of the mechanism, inside the tomographer. Looking at the tomography of fragment A, we can see here the different elements contained in this fragment, gears, shafts, and other elements. If we choose only the density of copper, we have these results with a better view on the various elements inside the fragment. Here is an example of how the front of the mechanism was designed with the help of tomographies. In the following slides, I will show you how the back side of the mechanism was drawn with the help of the tomographies of fragments A, B, E, and F. The fragments A, B, E, and F. Here we see the assembling of these four fragments. Looking now at the tomographies of the composite fragments, we see this picture which corresponds to a large part of the backside of the mechanism. Here we see the complete cycle of Saros, the eclipse dial. The divisions on which engraved symbols are read are marked with blue color. Here are some of those divisions that carry engraved symbols. But what do these symbols mean? Sigma means Selene, moon, and indicate a lunar eclipse. Eta, Ilios, sun, which refers to a solar eclipse. The next symbol consists of two letters of the Greek alphabet, omega and rho, for the word hora, hour. Mi, imera, day, the moon eclipse is not visible. and theta is the numeric value of the eclipse, in this case 8. There is another symbol, ni ypsilon, nihta, night. The sun eclipse is not visible. In the 17th century, Johannes Kepler, in relation to the sun and moon movements, claimed that the motion was not circular and suggested that it was an ellipse orbit. I will show you that the movement of the moon described in this sentence, known as the first and second law of Kepler, is simulated by the Antikythera mechanism with very great accuracy. Had this not been taken into account by the builders of the mechanism, then it would not correctly calculate the position nor the phase of the moon. But how the mechanism simulates the moon motion around the Earth, in fragment A, at this point, is a gear with 223 teeth. Nearby, there are 2 gears with 50 teeth each. What was their use? We see in this tomography these 2 gears, the gear E6 and the gear K2. In the bottom of the second gear, the gear K2, there is something like pregauge. And here, a tomography 2 millimeter deeper. The brick is not there, and the upper one gear sits on a pentagonal shape. These are 2 more gears, the gear E5 and the gear K1, which are below the first 2. Here is an enlargement of the breakpoint of gear K2. With a careful observation, it appears that it is not a break, but a slot in which a pin is located. The upper gear with a slot is mounted eccentric in relation to the gear with a pin and is driven from it by means of a pin. During the rotation of the gears, due to this eccentricity, the radius of the contact point of the pin in the slot changes. While the angular velocity of the lower gear is constant, the angular velocity of the upper gear is variable. This variable angular velocity is then transmitted to the axis which rotates the pointer of the moon. Here we see the whole system, which consists of 6 gears. This movement simulates the actual lunar motion with an accuracy of 1 to 400. It is indeed the simulation of the laws of Kepler. Here is a schematic representation of the mechanism structure. Different colors mark the individual gear trains. And here, how we redesign the whole gear chain of the mechanism. The model has 19 shafts, 39 gears, and 8 pointers. How did we come to this conclusion? Here, we see the design gears and shafts and their correlation with the real ones found in the fragment A. Using the tomography of the fragments, we identified the various elements contained in the fragments, and on the basis of these results, we redesigned and constructed a replica of the mechanism. Here, we see all the reconstructed gears of the mechanism. Here, the larger and the smaller gear of the mechanism. In this video, we can see a virtual assembling of the mechanism in order to understand how complicated it is. Since the construction of the mechanism until today, the position of the constellations in the sky has been shifted by about 30 degrees. To find out the accuracy of the predictions of the mechanism for the present era, in the model we see, we have captured on the front of the mechanism, on the scale of the dates, and on the scale of the zodiac constellations, the today's reality. Based on current estimates for the 15th of June 2011, the forecasts were Sun in the constellation of Taurus, Moon in the constellation of Sagittarius, full moon, and total lunar eclipse at 11 p.m. The corresponding displays of the mechanism for this day are exactly the same. The Sun is projected on the constellation of Taurus. The Moon is projected on the constellation of Sagittarius, and we will have a full moon. This means that a moon eclipse is possible. At 22:30, we see in this photo that the eclipse of the moon has begun. Here we see the lower part of the backside of the mechanism. Here is the Saros dial and the eclipses pointer. With regard to the lunar eclipse, the mechanism showed lunar eclipse at 9 o'clock. The Exelimos pointer shows a delay of 8 hours. Because the first hour in antiquity was the 6 o'clock morning of our time, the full cover of the moon through the shadow of the earth will occur at 23:00, exactly at the same time as the forecast. Indeed, we see the total lunar eclipse over the Acropolis of Athens in Greece exactly at 11 p.m. Except of the physical models, we have developed an application in virtual reality environment in Windows operating system. The application simulates the operation of the physical models. The indicators on both sides of the mechanism are presented in an image format and not as numerical results. I will show you 2 examples of calculations using this application. The first one is the astronomical phenomena of today, 8th of October 2021. The sun and the moon today are projected on the constellation of Virgo, as the mechanism and the application has also calculated. And the moon is in ascending phase. The next example is the calculation of the astronomical phenomena which will occur next year on 8 November 2022. The forecast of the application and the models of the mechanism show that at this day we will have a full moon and a lunar eclipse. We see here the eclipses pointer, and we can read the letter sigma, which means that on this day we will have a lunar eclipse. The calculation of the mechanism is confirmed by the corresponding forecast of NASA, as we see here. Conclusions. Technological landmarks of ancient Greek, like the Heros steam engine and the Antikythera mechanism, under the right conditions, could be the trigger for the Industrial Revolution many centuries earlier. Thank you for
Thanks so much for Professor Estatius. Study this excellent presentation. Thank you so much. 我不知道
I wonder if there are any questions or comments from our friends here in the auditorium or friends online listening to this presentation. I feel like I am watching a movie about how from underwater archaeology, excavation, all the information, and then the analysis of conservation science to really construct this digital cultural heritage
documentation, the three most important aspects of DCH: documentation, analysis, and research, as well as simulation. Together, you demonstrated to us how to also present the information and to represent the values of this digital cultural heritage. In this Antikythera mechanism and the entire reconstruction, the excavation, the integration of knowledge, your use of digital informatics, the simulation, this is really the hard work of an entire team. The University of the Cyprus University of Technology is a pioneer in this study, and I'm very grateful for Professor Evstatio for participating in this forum.
I'd like to say to the Taiwan audience, Taiwan colleagues,
Are there anything you would like to talk with the Taiwanese audience? Professor Evstatio, could you hear us? If you can hear us, yeah, could you say a few words with the audience here? Thank you.
First of all, if there are questions, you can put them on the chat, and I will answer the questions later. And I want to correct something said by you. I am not the chair of the UNESCO chair. We have two chairs in our university. The UNESCO chair, the ERA chair is my colleague Marinos Ioannidis, and the corresponding chair of the European Research Area, the ERA chair on digital cultural heritage, and I am the chair of this, the European chair. But we are in the same lab and we work together. As I presented to you in the first slide, our mission is, our approach is a holistic approach. That means we try to find out a way starting from the data acquisition, data processing, data modeling, knowledge management, until to preservation and use and reuse of the data referring to cultural informatics. This is what I wanted to mention. If you want something more, I am available.
Thank you so much.
In the Cyprus University of Technology, there's also the other chair, Professor Marino. He's also a good friend of us. So both of you are part of the UNESCO project, and you are the ERA chair in digital cultural heritage. So both of you are chairs of these projects. Every 2 years, you serve your term. So in every 2 years, you have a European and Mediterranean Digital Cultural Heritage Symposium. The symposium is held every 2 years. You have held it for many years already. So maybe in 2022?
Will it be much possible?
Yes, it will. Yes, I forget to mention this. Every 2 years, we have an international conference here in Cyprus in this frame. I mean, regarding the cultural heritage, the digital cultural heritage, but not only this. What else? Yes. It's good to remind you what I showed in the first slide, that we plan now, we developed a master course in this area, in the digital cultural heritage area, a distance learning master course in English. This will have a dower of 2 years. And I believe that it is be ready to start in a year from now.
Thanks for the information, and I'm very sure that there will be some very nice paper from Taiwan will participate the 2022 Euromate in Cyprus. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
好，我们非常谢谢
We're very grateful for Professor Evstatio for sparing your time and for this presentation.
So thank you for your presentation again. As we're looking forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
好，我们下一位的
Our third speaker today is our Professor Wang Chunxi from National Taipei University. He graduated with a PhD degree in architect in National Cheng Kung University. He's also an ICOMOS member. He participates in many of the ICOMOS subcommittees. He's very active in this area. He's a very young and promising researcher. We're very happy that Professor Wang today would be sharing with us his experience in participating in ICOMOS. In this year's ANIH workshop, one of our key mission is to encourage more young scholars and practitioners to take part in international activities. We have experts and scholars from Australia, from Cyprus today. We really encourage a lot of you to seize these opportunities, including those in Cyprus University of Technology. In the following, Professor Wang will be sharing with us his experience in participating in ICOMOS.
好。
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yan, for inviting me to the Industrial Heritage Conference. I would like to welcome all of you attending today's conference in person and online. I will share with you my past decade of experience in participating in international networks and organizations, and hopefully I will be able to shed some light on ways to interact with the international communities for Taiwanese scholars and practitioners. Please allow me to introduce myself first. I graduated from the Department of Architecture, National Cheng Kung University. I am currently an assistant professor at the Graduate Institute of Folk Arts and Cultural Heritage, National Taipei University. I'm a member of ICOMOS. I specialize in cultural heritage, research, and conservation. ICOMOS is a leading international professional advisory body on cultural heritage. Its members, found in different origins or regions across the world, are actively involved in the decision-making process of cultural heritage conservation in their countries. So it's important to be part of the ICOMOS network. Over the years, ICOMOS has become an influential international network and community, and the professional consensus reached by its members has influenced mainstream perspectives on heritage conservation. So, in my talk today, I will share my experience of participating in ICOMOS and its International Scientific Committee. I will also talk about my observation of how these international organizations operate and their potential influence on Taiwan's regulatory frameworks and perspectives on cultural heritage conservation. Like-minded people gather in ICOMOS and share their insights and bounce ideas with one another. So today, in addition to sharing how these international organizations operate and their potential implications on Taiwan's heritage communities. I will also share some case studies. ICOMOS is dedicated to the preservation and protection of cultural heritage. It is the only such non-governmental organization in the world dedicated to promoting the application of theory, methodology, and science and technology in the protection of architectural and archaeological heritage. It encompasses many fields, such as encompasses many members, including architects, historians, archaeologists, historians, geographers, just to name a few. Its members come from a wide variety of different professions. We have anthropologists, engineers, politicians, decision makers, urban planners, to name a few. The different fields that are being explored and discussed at ICOMOS also cover a wide range of topics. For example, architecture, historic sites, historic cities, and archaeological sites, which is something that's traditionally very familiar to some of us, in addition to cultural landscapes and archaeological sites. ICOMOS was established following the adoption of the Venice Charter, in 1964. After it was adopted, ICOMOS was established in June 1965. Conferences and seminars are held every 3 years. ICOMOS currently has 28 scientific committees. I have participated in the following committee meetings, including the poster presentation in 2008. My poster was accepted, however, I wasn't able to physically attend the conference due to some personal family matters. But my friend went and made the presentation on my behalf. In 2011, I also attended a seminar. Back at the time, I was still a graduate student studying in Europe. So I was told by my thesis advisor that there's this conference in 2011 in Paris, France. So I made it to the seminar, and I also gave another poster presentation in Delhi, India in 2017. When I went to Quebec in Canada, it came to my realization that normally an overarching theme is selected for the conference of that year, and usually under that theme and related topics, a declaration would then be announced. And such a declaration will echo the most important trends and developments of the heritage community at the time in that particular year. In 2008, the theme was the spirit of the place between the intangible and the tangible. And under that overarching theme, there was 4 different subtopics. For my poster presentation, I presented the pilgrimage, the religious pilgrimage routes in Taiwan, and its implications and interactions with the local community and cultural assets conservation. And this also echoed with the amendment to the Cultural Heritage Act in 2005. In that act, there were new categorization and different classifications of cultural heritage in Taiwan. So I decided to pick the pilgrimage as the topic of my presentation. In 2011, I went to Paris for another presentation at ICOMOS General Assembly. There were, in fact, 4 different themes, if you will: heritage and regional development, development and the return to the art of building, tourism and development, and lastly, the economics of development. is heritage a factor of economic development? I had the opportunity to visit the headquarters of UNESCO. It was at that time that the conference was going to be held in Iran. However, Iran backed out of the deal last minute, so the conference was eventually held at the headquarters at UNESCO. So it was a tremendous honor for me to be standing on the stage at the headquarters of UNESCO. I felt that I had come a very long way because there would always be influences and pressures from different sources. For example, in terms of your name tag, in terms of the presentation that you present at international meetings, there would be political pressures, especially at large assemblies and conferences. There would be political influences at play. And at this specific conference, I presented the sustainable development of the cultural heritage, of the cultural landscape of Jianan irrigation system in Taiwan. From Jianan, from Jiayi to Tainan, is the area covered by the Jianan waterway. There, of course, are a lot of tangible heritage elements that normally come to our attention. They are very valuable heritage. However, in my discussion at the conference, I also brought to the audience attention the intangible elements to conserve a water heritage or facilities. We need to also take into consideration that it is a living and functional facility. And I think this was also raised by Ian, because Ian raised the fact that we need to consider other elements. For example, usually the water canals and the irrigation systems are facilities that are still being used concurrently with the conservation efforts, and that might be in conflict with the conservation direction of various different programs. So when considering conserving heritage landscapes, we need to take different perspectives into account. When it comes to cultural landscape or landscapes that are still being actively used, we need to also consider the temporal changes and the transformation of the heritage. For example, in this case, we were discussing the transformation and evolution of a water canal. When a society has progressed from traditional agricultural society to an industrialized society, the farms are being converted in commercial properties, and the sectors have also evolved to stop focusing on agriculture. The use, therefore, of the water canals also shifted over time. I believe these different points, whether it's regarding water facilities or the functions of these built water structures, would have to be reconsidered. For example, here in a few minutes, I will be introducing to you for example, the sugar refineries. The sugar refineries in Taiwan have been decommissioned. However, its various facilities, its wide grounds where it sits on, are to be revitalized, and I will touch upon that here in a few minutes. Many of you are listening to simultaneous translation, and so I was wearing these translation headsets to listen to myself being translated into English and French simultaneously. In e-commerce meetings, the official languages are in fact English and Spanish. Excuse me, English and French. The language Spanish was added to the list official language at the same time. Professor from Chen Kong University also attended the meeting, and we had this group photo taken together, including Ms. Jan and Professor Cao. These are all presenters from Taiwan. In 2007, we went to Delhi, India to attend yet another ICOMOS meeting under the theme of heritage and democracy. Here are the different themes. For example, integrating heritage and sustainable urban development. Theme 2, the role of heritage in building peace and reconciliation. And we also talked about protecting and interpreting cultural heritage in the age of digital empowerment. And the last theme in 2017 was culture nature journey, exploring the complexities of human relationships with nature, natural and cultural places. This is a very important keyword that's being emphasized by e-commerce. It's emphasizing the fact that a lot of cultural heritage is interconnected and combined with natural heritages. So in my presentation that year, I reported on agricultural heritage, which is one of the projects I was working on at that point. It is located in the Longyan, the Longyan fruit plantation in Dongshan area in Taiwan. I talked about the complete production system revolving the agricultural practice. For example, the roasting and the drying of the fruit and the different facilities and man-made structures created to fulfill the needs of the Longyan production industry. So my presentation focused on that as a topic. I also joined the panel discussion, and we discussed our experiences and practices. So we talked about the general public centered community based heritage and how important it is to base our efforts on in the local communities to allow the people to have a voice in telling their own stories. By empowering the people by listening to their stories, we were able to tell the stories revolving around the heritage in Dongshan area. There are in fact over 700 roasting stoves for Longyan. At one time, at the peak of the industry, there were over 2,000 of such kilns or stoves for roasting the fruit. However, through community development and empowerment programs, we were able to conduct field research and to find out the exact number of these stoves that are still in existence at the time of our survey. We also communicated with residents of the local community to enhance their awareness and understanding of cultural heritage.
开幕的仪式哈，我记得
And this is the opening ceremony at the ICOMOS in India. One of the keynote speakers was a philosopher. It was a very unforgettable setting. And this is a panel discussion that we were part of. You probably see many familiar scholars, including Professor Lin, one of our speakers this morning. The poster presentation is in a simpler format. It is broadcasted and shown on the TV screen. Another participation of mine is the International Scientific Committee, focusing on particular issues. Under ICOMOS, there are a wide number of ISCs of these international scientific committees. Through these scientific committees, we can further lead groups of experts, young scholars who are interested in this area of study to build their knowledge to become more professional in these sub areas. There are many works and related outcomes produced by these committees. I am most involved in the ICCL, the International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscape, Industrial Heritage. I have also took part in ISOFORT as well as SIPA. During the during the General Assembly in India, I also took part in ICORP, the subcommittee on risk prevention. Overall, I'm most involved in ICO Fort as well as the International Science Committee on Cultural Landscape Industrial Heritage. ISCCL was founded in 1971 in France, the Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscape. It focuses first on these historical gardens. In 1982, it adopted the Florence chapter, focusing on these historical gardens as cultural landscape. Later on in 2017, ICOMOS passed and adopted the ICOMOS IFLA principles concerning rural landscapes as heritage. It also adopted the document on historic urban public parks. This shows that these historical parks and gardens are a very important focus of ISCCL. These historical gardens are quite similar to many of the historical architecture that we often focus on. With this confirmation, we have started to see many rural landscapes being recognized as heritage. And that's why we saw these related principles and documents. These documents serve as a guidance for us to recognize rural landscapes as heritage. So here, a brief definition of cultural landscape. Cultural landscape reflects this very unique interactive relationship between people and nature over long periods of time. It shows that over long periods of time, human in the society, in nature, has developed these unique landscape, cultural landscape. These cultural landscape interact with the surrounding society, economy, and nature. They also become stress. They also pose stress on the environment, or they present opportunities. So this is this unique relationship between people and the surrounding environment. In World Heritage List, there are quite a number of cultural landscapes. These are the different cultural landscape sites inscribed on the World Heritage List. And here, plus one of the cultural heritage list, it's in Germany. So it shows that some of these cultural heritage, they were removed from the World Heritage List, but they are a recognized cultural landscape. So there are a number of definitions. To put it simply, the first one are the parks and the gardens. The second are these organically involved landscape. Over a long period of time, people use the environment for different purposes, forming landscapes along the time. Depending on the evolution of time, there are two main types. The first is these relics or fossil landscapes. For example, mining plants. These mines are no longer active or living, and these are the so-called relic or fossil landscape. The other type of organic landscape are these continuing living landscape. Many of these living landscape are in agricultural industry or in forestry, for example. Or the photo you see here, this is a vineyard. We took part in one of these tours and we visited a vineyard. The third type are these cultural landscapes that don't exist physically, but they are related to arts, to cultures, to religion. They are intangible. For example, these pilgrimage, or in this photo, this is also a pilgrimage landscape. This is another type of cultural landscape. In ISCCL, In this committee, I have took part in these 3 events. The first one was in 2011. I took part in the ISCCL Post Tour during the ICOMOS Assembly. I was very interested in cultural landscape, so I took part in this post tour to Saint Emilion. This is in the Bordeaux area. It's very famous for its wine production, and this is one of the production areas. We were on this tour bus that took us around to different wineries, to different towns and vineyards. Along the tour, we visited one of these wineries. These are very expensive red wines. Each is like 10,000 euro. It's a very acclaimed winery. And these are the surrounding towns. You can see the vineyards adjacent to the towns. That was during December, so it's not the season, but you can see the land use patterns, the different boundaries between vineyards and the communities, showing this very unique cultural landscape. In the center of town, they also have the logo of the World Heritage Site recognition adopted in 1999. These are my friends who took part together in this post tour. We share a great passion in cultural landscape. I also got to talk with one of the Japanese professors. She is a professor from Japan standing next to me. I asked her why she joined, and she said joining vineyards, visiting vineyards will give us an opportunity to taste a glass of wine. And of course, wine tasting was part of the post tour. We were able to take part in these wine tasting events. This is also a great reflection of a living, continuing landscape related to agricultural activities. I really find these tours fascinating. We get to share our dishes, we share our bill together. It's like everybody will chip in 20, 30 euro. For me at that time, I was a PhD student. That was quite extravagant meal for me, but I was very glad to participate in that post tour and to have these interesting conversations with other colleagues. Another example was in 2016. At that time, the chair of ISCCL, Mr. Steve Brown, visited Taiwan. I got to have a conversation with Chair Brown. We discussed about different possibilities for Taiwan to apply in joining ICOMOS and ISCCL. Later on in 2017, in Delhi, India, I took part in the annual meeting. In 2017, that was also the ICOMOS General Assembly. All the ISC subcommittees also held meetings, and that was the first time that I participated in the committee meeting. The next meeting was in Argentina. I wasn't able to secure a visa, so I wasn't able to join the meeting in 2018. But then in 2019, I went to Dublin in Ireland. You can see Professor Lin, our speaker in the morning, next to me in the front row. In the Cultural Heritage Committee, here are a few of focal points: sustainability and cultural, climate change and culture, HIA, as well as rights-based approach. These are the different discussions about the interaction between human and environment. For example, climate change, sustainability, or Heritage Impact Assessment, HIA, the impact of human activities and the rights of local communities and citizens. These are the main focal points of our subcommittee. In our task force, we have a number of working groups. For example, how do we review World Heritage guidelines? Cultural nature integration, World Rural Landscape Initiative, Florence Charter and the assessment of Florence Charter, design landscape, aesthetics and cultural landscapes, as well as training of emerging professionals. I think the cultural landscape task force and committee attaches great importance on the trainings for emerging professionals. There's a very strong network of professionals. We come together, we discuss various items, we bring these items up in our General Assembly. We also touch upon indigenous perspectives, SDGs, as well as 20th century gardens and landscape. Many scholars in China especially focus on digital cultural landscape methods, practices, and tools. In 2020, since 2020, all of us started to turn many of these discussions online. In the past, we have our annual meetings. We meet once a year. But every time during these physical meetings, people are quite busy. We only have limited time. So since the outbreak of COVID-19 took place, we started to familiarize ourselves with digital tools. From 2020 onwards, we moved many of our meetings online, including our annual meetings as well as our monthly webinars. We hold these regular online meetings like once every 1 to 2 months. At one point in our annual meetings, we have 100 to 200 people online. Every month, we also have about 20 to 30 participants taking part in these regular online meetings. We get to have a better understanding of everyone's work. We also get to dive deeper into many of these issues. For example, this is one of the recent meetings that we took part. This is one of the monthly Cultural Landscape Working Group webinars. We talked about the different guidelines for the management of designed landscapes. Taking part in these international organizations allows me to reflect upon our practices domestically. For example, the definition of cultural landscape is very broad internationally as well. In Taiwan, we feel that it's a very broad term, and that's also the same case in international dialogues. In the cultural landscape committee, we also focus a lot on these gardens, parks, agricultural landscapes, the lives of indigenous people, and the different land use, the different landscape use. We also talk about relics, but the definition and the discussion is quite different from the discussion of cultural landscapes in other types. When we want to borrow and use these discourse on cultural landscape and adapt it to the sugar refineries in Taiwan, it has these implications. Here I categorize the different sugar refineries, those that are designated as a legal cultural landscape and those that are not designated as cultural landscape. This definition shows that under the area of industrial heritage, we make definitions because of its status, whether it's in operation or not. But using these different definitions and angles, we are able to further understand these different sugar refineries in Taiwan. This is the sugar refinery in Shantou, the warehouse area, the housing, the dormitory area. This is the sugar refinery in Douliu. A lot of these infrastructure do not no longer exist. There's also a lot of controversy regarding the conservation of the sugar refinery. This is the sugar refinery in Hualien. It looks pretty much complete, but if we want to designate it as a cultural heritage and we want to focus a bit more on the interaction between human and environment, we might need to further look into the production activities. This is also very important element of cultural landscape. All the different activities in production, the actual activities, the tools used, these are all very important components and aspects for us to describe the interaction between human and environment. And this will allow us to look at these structures from another perspective. We're not just looking at it from an industrial value. We are also able to take a more integrated approach in interpreting and understanding these structure. How about the sugar railway in the southern part of Taiwan? This is in Huwei. There's also the railroad connected to the sugar refinery to transport the sugar cane. We also know that in Taiwan, there are many of these ancient sugar railways. They disappear in urban development, they disappear in our landscape. And these are also issues that we often have to tackle when we try to understand and interpret cultural landscape. We look at these structures. There might be controversies, but if we take a different perspective, if we look at cultural landscape, we look at the production aspect of it, we will not be limited to one single structure or object. Furthermore, if we can take a broader perspective, looking at the production perspective. For example, these two sugar refineries are still in operation in Taiwan. We are able to reflect upon a broader range of values, not just about the roles of the structures of the architecture, but we get to appreciate it from a broader aspect. This is a ritual that the sugar refinery organize on an annual basis. This reflects many of the process of sugar refinement. When we take part, when we get to visit the sugar refinery, you also get to see these many major differences. These are the sugar refinery that are still in operation. The sound, the temperature, the smell, the taste. When I take students on these sugar refinery tours, we always learn so much, and the impression given to visitors is drastically different. When we visit these sugar refineries, they show us these crystallized sugar. It's really part of the production process. But for us, it's a great opportunity for us to reflect upon the entire sugar refining process. So when we want to capture and to better describe the sugar refinery culture, it's important that we visit these sugar refineries that are still in operation. For those that are no longer inactive, we need to further address the many challenges. This is in Hualien. It is designated as a historical monument. But if we look at it from the historical monument perspective, we will see many challenges and problems. So, sugar refineries as a cultural landscape, how do we further understand it from the perspective of people's life. Once in a while, I will try to get a bag of these sugar produced by these refineries that are still inactive. This is also another way for us to be part of this whole sugar production chain. From sugar production refining, from sugar cane grow, to all the way of how we use the sugar in our daily life. These are ways for us to reflect upon the concepts of cultural landscape. Here I would like to make a brief conclusion. ICOMOS is a huge organization. It follows the membership structure of UNESCO. I believe that it's hard for ICOMOS to truly represent the voices of civic organizations. In contrast, ICSC, the International Science Committee, focuses more on professional issues. I think it is a better platform for us to participate. We participate in these international meetings and gatherings. We can bring a lot of lessons back to the cultural heritage preservation environment in Taiwan. But the impact is still limited. We participate in these meetings as individuals. Take my example. So, how do we bring out these impacts? How do we generate collective impacts to make sure that these international experience and participation can have a larger impact in the entire community in Taiwan? This is also something that we need to continue to work on. Thank you.
我们谢谢王尊先。
Thank you, Professor Wang, for sharing your thoughts with us. We have a few minutes left. So for those of you joining us online or for those of you in attendance today, please feel free to raise questions if you have any. I will raise the first question. Professor Wang, I think this is a question that we are very familiar with. Cultural heritage is often used, sometimes being abused when you do not know what or how to call a historic site. You call it a cultural landscape. Do you think that today people have a deeper understanding of what a cultural heritage or a cultural landscape really is? The um, the uh, the Cultural Heritage Act has been amended at least twice. So, can you talk about whether the new version is a significant improvement from the previous ones? Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yan, for your comment and questions. The very first version of the Cultural Heritage Act that was promulgated in 2005, it felt that any objects or sites with cultural value can be termed or referred to as a cultural landscape. However, we need to make a distinction between landscapes and other types of heritage. For example, you may call a specific site a cultural heritage, but in reality, it may only involve a historic building that is currently being renovated. So there are a lot of uncertainties. People say that we've been given a lot of flexibility. However, the downside of it is that there's a lot of gray area. There's a lack of clarity, a lot of ambiguity. So when it has made it difficult for the public to grasp or comprehend the idea. So in the amendment in 2016 or between 2005 and 2016, there have been a lot of cultural heritage cases, and we have seen dramatic changes since the amendment to the Act in 2016, with a strong focus on the human interaction with the landscape, coming from a historical ethnology and anthropological perspectives. So there is also a problem regarding people's different standards. The judgment committee and the panel's different standards, criteria is being used to determine whether it is cultural landscape or not. Thank you for your response. A lot of cultural landscapes are being turned into historic sites and vice versa. What exactly does that mean? You mentioned in 2016 the Cultural Heritage Act had been amended, and the value of historic sites is highlighted in the new act. The Historic Sites Act can be it could be manifested in a column in a specific architectural feature. It could be broken down into details. It has to be very specific in its description. So, in a lot of the regeneration project today, when the project proposal talks about the value of the historic site, it's not specific. It only offers a very all-encompassing general description of the site. So, what did I mean when I said that a lot of landscapes are being turned into sites or vice versa? I think you have covered this area, but I will not repeat what has already been talked about. So, when it comes to the value of built structure in the landscape, I believe that the focus should not be comparing the building in a landscape with historic sites. Because then you would be placing too much emphasis on the architectural or built structure aspect in this landscape instead of taking a holistic view and approach in revitalizing and conserving the entire landscape. So sometimes when conservationists or researchers need to be very specific, they are using a very, very relaxed standards. And sometimes when they need to be more broad in term and holistic in their perspective, they instead are focusing on the specific details. So this year, we will be organizing youth workshops between the 14th and 18th of October, and many schools are involved in the execution of these workshops. And I believe that the conservation of landscapes and historic sites will be brought up again during these workshops. In the previous presentations today, we already talked about the combination of natural and cultural heritage, and in the University of Cyprus professor's presentation, he talked about recording, archiving, and representation as well as interpretation. These are all very important topics that we will explore in the upcoming series of very interactive workshops or youth workshops. We have a lot of students joining today's conferences, and they have all signed up for the workshops that are coming up in a few days. And I think the the question or the theme of where to go from here and how to approach the conservation of these heritages and landscapes will become the focal point of our upcoming workshops. So that sums up our presentation and discussion today. We will take a 10-minute break. The time now is 4:03 Taipei time, and we will return and the program will resume at 4:13. Thank you.
上位不用坐在上面吗？
就等他们曾老师您介绍第一位处长上来，他讲完，接着介绍张老师讲完，
不是一次介绍完，
不是一次，一个一个介绍。各位线上的朋友，大家好，以及非常感谢各位一直到现在还陪伴着我们现场的各位讲者跟主持人。那首先，我们欢迎下午我们最后一场的综合座谈——产业文化资产的自然与文化之旅的主持人，国立高雄大学建筑系教授曾子峰曾教授。曾教授，请。
好，各位线上朋友，大家好哈。那首先呢，我已经非常高兴的、非常荣幸的能够来主持这个。
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the panel discussion. The theme of this panel is the cultural, natural journey of industrial heritage and the interconnectedness and the relationship between cultural and natural heritage. We will have the opportunity to listen to presentations by 3 speakers. The first speaker will be Mr. Huang. He is from the Alishan Forest Railway Administration. We will also hear from Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang will talk about the modernization progress of Taiwan's agricultural heritage. He is from the Taiwan Cultural Heritage Association. Mr. Lin from the National Taiwan Museum will talk about the experience of industrial heritage in the transformation of museums, or the role of the heritage in the museums. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Miaoxiu Huang from the Alishan Forest Railway and Cultural Heritage Office.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizer for your invitation. We have listened to many experts sharing your different focus of studies and practices. And I think listening to your sharing, I feel that our office is lagging quite behind. But we are ready, and we are ready to further promote our railway and cultural heritage. We talked about cultural landscape. In 2003, we were registered as the Alishan Forest Railway Cultural Landscape. We also, at some point, named ourselves as Alishan Forest Railway, so it's quite confusing. This is not the main topic of today. We once invited experts from UNESCO to come to our sites and to try to interpret what are the most valuable core of Alishan Forest Railway and cultural heritage. These experts highlighted the uniqueness of our ecology, of our ecologic environment, and also the forestry aspects of Alishan, the animals and the vegetation. It is this unique natural environment that then led to the logging industry in Taiwan. So in the past, we always thought that the railway is the core, but according to the observation of these international experts, we can take a different perspective. Indeed, we have this very important railway system, but this is not the most unique aspect. There are also other railway systems in different parts of the world. It's better that we step one back behind to look at the entire environment, natural environment. At that time in history, we had the forestry office, the forestry production agency, the logging office. We have these historical housing areas, the lives of people at that time. And that's why we came together to talk about forestry, about humanities, about life. However, the foreign experts further gave us advice on deepening our discourse on history, on culture. We talked about cultural landscape, about the interconnection between human and environment, both the intangible and tangible landscape. It's important we talk about history, about the value of the industries. It's not just a very simple storytelling, but it's based on very solid research and studies. It's a very deep argument. We also need to look into the cultures and the arts, not only in the past 100 years, not only since the Japanese period, but also the indigenous tribes, the Zhou tribe, how their lives are connected with the mountains of Alishan. Alishan was not the place where they lived, but it was their hunting ground. How this hunting ground connected with the indigenous groups. We also need to trace back to the periods of the Dutch colonies, to the Qing dynasty, to all the peoples who have once called this area home. We need to deepen our research in humanities. We also need to document the transformation from the forest park and to all these more modern transformation. So it's not just about the railway system. There are also many of these forest railways in other parts of the world. More importantly, how was the decision made to import that railway system? And where did the logging products go? How was it transported to other parts of the world? What was that cultural impact? What was that cultural exchange over hundreds of years? It is this type of depth that we are looking for, that we need to further build in order to be registered as a World Heritage Site. With this clarification, we finally became clear about the values of Alishan Forest Railway, from ecology, from natural environment railway to forestry, and how that connects to industries, to people's lives, to the development of cities, to the development of Taiwan, to cultures, to humanities. Forestry is one of the first industries in Taiwan, right even before sugar refinery. At that time, because of logging, because of forestry, Jiayi was one of the largest cities in Taiwan. Many of the international connections are also built upon this forestry development in Taiwan. So now we are clear that we have this whole evolution, have this whole development from ecology, from natural environment, all the way to our industry, to the railway. And that is how we were finally registered as a cultural landscape in 2019. In our logo, we also highlight all these different aspects, the animals, the people, the vegetation, the architect, the ways of living. So I have this video to share with all of you. It's a 45-second. Sorry, it's not a video. It's it's a video and the logo of Alishan Forest Railway Cultural Landscape. Here you see the carts and the water buffaloes. This is the Duli Mountain station. You see the different forests. This is fireflies. You'll see the bamboo forest. You'll see these different animals, the mountain goats. And our sunset, our railway and the birds, the sansho fish. We finally clarified and understood our value, and then we were able to further develop this logo and promote our values. This is also the work that we have been actively engaged in the last couple years. We have did a lot of renovation with our railway carts. We have added a lot of experiences for visitors to enjoy, to experience the cultures, the entire natural environment. We also worked with a lot of communities along the railway route. This is the most important part of the work. This talks about the connection between the local residents and the entire railway. We did a lot of these field works and local visits. We have connected these communities together. We try to highlight many of these features of the different communities. We involved the community citizens. We even have these ambassadors from the Ali Shan at the Ali Mountain. They come here, they learn about their own stories, and then they pass on and share their stories with others. We also have many of these different visual presentations. We have introduced a lot of these AR technologies, for example, these apps to represent the many historical landscapes and sites. All of these materials are also translated into Japanese and into English. We have different modes. Some are more interactive, some are based on illustration, and some are more research oriented. We also have a special exhibition held in the Chiayi Arts Museum to present the different aspects of the cultures and the cultural landscape of Ali Mountain. We are focusing also a lot on international exchange. We want to enhance our global visibility. In the past, we are more passive. We were more passive. We probably exchanged posters. We didn't have a lot of activities, but now we really focus on these international promotion. We connect our websites with our sister groups in the UK, in Japan, in Slovakia, in Japan. We have sister railways. We also focus on in-depth exchange. How do we enhance the safety of our railways? How do we further deepen our exchange on concrete issues? In the last 2 years, we have organized and been part of 8 international exchange opportunities. For example, we will send staff to each other to repair each other's cards, or we will send our cards to other parts of the world, and we get to exchange with others. We have our carts with Taiwan's flags running their routes in Europe. So this is our expectation for ourselves. We want to use the Alishan Forest Railway as a mean to engage in railway diplomacy with other countries and friends around the world. And this concludes my sharing. I represent the Alishan Forest Railway Cultural Landscape Office, and I really appreciate your support.
Thank you, Ms. Huang. you talked about the Forestry Railway and its cultural landscape. The Alishan Forest Railway and Cultural Heritage Office is a newly established government agency. It's constantly seeking and is dedicated to developing new management models. It is a government agency. However, it is elevating its own jobs to protecting and conservation and conserving the cultural landscape for the good of the public. Next, we would like to welcome Kunzhen Chang. He is the chair of the Taiwan Heritage Society. He will give a presentation on the modernization process of Taiwan's agricultural heritage. Let us give him a very warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zhen. This year, we are celebrating the 100th birthday of the society. And I would especially like to draw your attention to the fact that Taiwan's agricultural landscape has come a very long way, and I would like to speak from a researcher's perspective and focus on Taiwan's sugar production industry, which has a very long history here in Taiwan. Over the past decades, the sugar refinery and its landscapes have been recognized as an important cultural asset. Many people are researching the various sugar refineries, the decommissioned, particularly the decommissioned ones, and particularly their relationship with the agricultural landscapes in Taiwan in recent years. My topic is the modernization of Taiwan's agricultural heritage. However, I would like to focus on two aspects. Number one is the modernization. The number two is colonization, which is a topic that some researchers tend to shy away from because it could get personal. It could involve a personal sentiment. So the combination of the two topics is something that's just beginning to get more attention, to get more traction in the academic community in Taiwan. Now, let me begin. I would like to, so bear that in mind as I progress through my slides. This is a photo or a map that was created in the 40s. This is where the most important and the largest refineries were scattered. After World War II, only four major refineries remained. There is the Imperial Refinery, which is located in Taichung, that was established by the Japanese during the Japanese colonial period. As you could see, at its peak, the refineries or sugar production workshops could be found all around Taiwan, with the exception of the mountainous area. Basically, every town or village had some sort of sugar production facility. This also reflects the fact that the location of the sugarcane plantations. As you could see, they could be found not just in southern Taiwan, central Taiwan, in Jiayi or in the Jianan Plain. They could also be found in the northern part of Taiwan. When we visit the refinery, and we've taken many trips to the decommissioned refineries around Taiwan. A lot of these refineries have been turned into cultural landscapes or cultural parks, regenerated by the local government agencies. For example, the unnamed sugar refinery has been turned into a movie set, a movie studio where a lot of the movies and TV programs in Taiwan are being shot. So, what are the major reasons for that transformation? I will talk about that later. So, ANIH Sugar Refinery has been turned into a movie set. And this is an example, which is the Wushuling Sugar Refinery, a now decommissioned refinery. It was later turned into a orchid seedling and plantation. It has taken on a different direction. One was turned into a movie set, one was turned into a seedling nursery. However, they have been given the status of important cultural heritage. This week I was reading about the regeneration project of Chicago. It went from an agricultural community to a largely urbanized city landscape. And I was reading this very interesting article about the modernization of the city. Necessary elements would have to be in place for modernization to take place. You would need land, you would need injection of capital, you would need, of course, the industrialization process. So going back to what I was saying, that at the turn of the century, why were there so many refineries being set up in the western part of Taiwan? In fact, in 1902, the sugar industry incentive regulations were launched. This was during the Japanese colonial period. And in fact, many mechanical sugar refineries were set up exactly at this period in time. The government was providing subsidies for sugarcane seedlings, fertilizer, cultivation, irrigation, and for the establishment of large sugar production facilities. More importantly, the government was providing land to local sugar associations so the land could be used for sugarcane cultivation free of charge, and the land after the completion of land reclamation will be transferred to the developers free of charge. Lastly, the government at the time was providing land free of charge for the development of irrigation and drainage systems. In the interest time, I will not be going to details. So this is a map of the Taiwan Sugar Refinery Research Institute located in Xinhua. You could see that the refinery is located to the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you see geometric shaped farms. So this is a very interesting model of the irrigation and sugarcane cultivation system at the time. It is linked to the Hutopi Reservoir. So through this systematic development, the sugarcane refinery was established along with an agricultural vocational school that is located just right in the neighborhood. This is what the Sugar Refinery and Research Institute looks like today. In the modernization process, traditional land, with the aid of the use of machinery, and in order to fulfill the needs of irrigation, drainage, and transportation, the land was transformed, and it was transformed dramatically. As you could see, to the left, you have the Research Institute, and the headquarters or the offices were located toward the upper left corner. You see where the railroad runs through the landscape, and you could also see the location of the irrigation canals and drainage systems. This had been developed between 1902 and 1910. During a very short period of time, this type of systems emerged on the landscape of Taiwan across the entire island. So this period was a period of drastic transformation for the Taiwanese agricultural history. And some of you might have heard of the Xinshe Floral Festival. In fact, the location for the festival was used to cultivate sugarcane seedlings that will be supplied to all the sugar refineries and sugarcane plantations across Taiwan. So here are some photos of the sugarcane seedling nursery at the time. So the entire system is in place. As you could see in the upper right corner, we have an ancient map of the layout of the watercourse and canals at the time. So this is another view of the layout of the plantations. You could see the location of the railroads, of the watercourses, the canals, the entire irrigation system and transportation system are mapped out on the graph. So you could see more diagrams of the Bailan Canal, a waterway that serves the irrigational purposes of the area. So the modernization process does not just involve the establishment of plantations, but also the irrigation and transportation system. In the 20s, the Jianan Canal construction began. Here I'm showing a map of the Zhuoshui branch of the Jianan Canal in Yunlin County in southern Taiwan. As you could see, the main lines are expressed in the darker blue line, and the lighter shaded blue indicates the branches, and you could also see the relative location of the sugarcane plantations that are located near the water sources. So as you could see, in 1910, drastic transformation took place, and all these canals and waterways were rapidly established during a relatively short period of time. Here we have some photos showing you the Luxiliao Reservoir, which is still in existence today. Therefore, speaking of the agricultural landscapes here in Taiwan, we will have to consider in combination with production facilities and the government development policies at the time. And the same theory can be applied to the cultivation of tobacco leaves at the time. As you could see, these plantations were mainly located at higher altitude near the mountainous areas. Here we have a map of the agricultural extension and guidance station. As you could see, on the map, you would see the waterways, irrigation facilities, and drainage systems. And what is even more important, that you could see that this is a great example of the land reform program implemented by the government in 1910. This is yet another example, the tobacco cultivation agricultural extension station in Hualien. And we have the tobacco curing facility and the offices, and the settlement area that serves the residential need of the workers can also be observed on this map. Yet on this another map, you would be able to see that it is exactly during this period that geometrically shaped, more regularly shaped farms were being developed at this time. This is yet another example, an ancient map of the plantations located in Pingdong in southern Taiwan. Taiwan's agricultural landscape experienced drastic changes around this period in time. In addition, salt fields or salt drying fields also experienced similar evolution or transformation at that time, at that specific period in time. So, by taking different approaches, we will be able to uncover the lesser known aspects of the production and agricultural landscapes in Taiwan. So, that was back in 1910 during the Japanese colonial period. And another period of drastic change began after World War II, after the communist conquest of China and the arrival of the Nationalist Party, but that will be another story. That concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Zhang for sharing with us the modernization progress between 1902 to 1910, and how that brought Taiwan from an agricultural society to an industrial one, and its impact on the entire landscape in Taiwan. Many of us, we are very familiar with the Taiwan sugar refinery. We grew up in many of these neighborhoods and around the refinery. So I believe that there's still a lot to study about the role of sugar refinery in Taiwan's cultural landscape. Last but not the least, we have Professor Lin to share with us the experience of industrial heritage transformation from a museum's perspective. He's a senior curator at National Taiwan Museum. Let's welcome Mr. Lin. All the friends here and friends online, good afternoon. This is the National Taiwan Museum, where I work as a curator. This is the most historical museum in Taiwan, established in 1908. It's mainly a natural history museum. During the Japanese colonial period, its mission was to educate the public, to collect and to exhibit the different collections here in Taiwan. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we have witnessed the modernization of the different industries in Taiwan. There are a few key features. For example, precision, extracting resources from nature using speed to produce various objects. A lot of production in different industries. Many of these industries are related to the unique environment of Taiwan. We've also witnessed the development of industries in the end of the Qing dynasty and during the Japanese ruling period. We look at the changes and the modernization of industries in Taiwan, and we can see the entire development of the economy here. Here we observe that many of these industries, these modernized industries, started in the west part of Taipei. The Machinery Bureau in 1885, during the Japanese ruling period. You can see along the yellow lines that this is the old Japanese. This was the old town of Taipei. You'll see where these different Machinery Bureau railway sites are located. The dark blue line, along the dark blue line, we'll also observe the different industrial sites. This is a snapshot that showcases the connection between transportation and industries. Many of these industries, they are interconnected with the abstraction of raw materials to power generation to transportation. It is rapidly changing. The processes also change. More importantly, many of these factories, they used to be in the at the fringe areas of the cities, but because of urban development, they become to be located at the center of the cities. And following, there's the need of transformation of these different areas. Here in the map of Taipei, we see how along the Science and Technology University of Taipei, there used to be textile factories, and now they are residential areas. We also see some of these kilns in the outskirts of Taipei, and now they are riverside parks. We see the disappearance of some of these factories. We see some of them turning into museums or cultural and art parks or sites. Many of the option is to transform these industrial sites into museums. There are often four main elements mentioned about museum: collection, exhibition, education, and research. These are the four key missions often mentioned about museums. So if we want to transform industrial heritage sites into museum, what are the connections? What are the different concepts? First of all, the industrial heritage site becomes a museum, or the collection, the museum collection, comes from the industrial heritage, or the exhibition content falls into the range of industrial heritage, or the purpose of exhibition is to promote industrial heritage. There's also the option of transforming these museums into the architecture type of industrial heritage. Since 2005, we have worked very hard in building this National Taiwan Museum system. Along the yellow lines, along the old town of Taipei, we focus on this area, and we have identified out of the 48 sites, the four main sites. We use these sites as major museums or sites for us to work with the government to renovate them, to turn them into museums. And one of them is related to industrial history. In the Nanmen Museum, in the center part of this old Taipei town, along the vertical zone, we have built this National Taiwan Museum system, including the four main museums that highlight the different topics, including natural history, including industrial history, and modernity. We want to present and highlight the cultural identity of Taiwan through this National Taiwan Museum system. This was the old photo of National Taiwan Museum. It used to serve the colonial power. In the past, in the second floor of the museum, that was this picture showed the natural history arm of the museum, the natural history, zoology, and botanical gallery. In 2018 to 2021, we have updated the entire collection of our natural history, and you could see the difference about how we pay tribute to its old gallery, but we also present the different natural history unique to Taiwan. On the opposite side of the Natural History Museum is the Museum of Paleontology History. It used to be a bank during the Japanese ruling period. You can see the Art Deco architect built in the 1930s that was most popular in Taipei at that time. We worked with the bank, we renovated the entire area, and from 2010, it became the Paleontology History Museum. The citizens of Taipei often call it as the Dinosaur Museum. The third site is the Nanmen Museum, focusing on industrial history in Taiwan. It has the collection and the exhibition about the largest camphor factory in Taiwan, not only in Taiwan, but also in entire Southeast Asia. This is the exhibition site for us to showcase the industrial history and the environment development in Taiwan. The fourth side is the original location of the Machinery Bureau. It also then was the Department of Railway during the Japanese ruling period. That was the headquarters for the Japanese government to manage the entire transportation system in Taiwan. Later on, we worked with the Taiwan Railway Company. Last year, we fully transformed it into the Railway Park of Taiwan, delving into the modern history and railway development that took place in Taiwan. We renovated and reused these industrial heritage. We did not remove them. We did not want to erase these traces of Taiwan's history. We want to reflect upon our past. This shows that in the democratization process of Taiwan, we are adopting a more inclusive perspective of history. We want to better connect the different spatial and historical development to present a more diverse range of values. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin, for sharing your perspective as a museum practitioner, how the facilities and architecture left from the industrialized period can be turned into part of a museum experience. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Now I would like to invite the three speakers to please go on stage and take their designated seat as we get ready to begin the panel discussion.
好，我们呢，下面这个10几分钟的时间呢。
The panel discussion will now begin. We will open the floor for questions. For those of you joining us in person and for viewers joining us online, please feel free to provide your feedback or raise questions. Professor Zhen, we believe that Mr. Ian Travers is in fact online. He would like to interact with you and be part of the panel discussion. Hi, Ian.
Really, in general, thank you very much for 3 fascinating presentations. And coming at this as I am from the sort of the culture nature perspective, it's wonderful to see. I think Professor Lin just at the end was talking about becoming more inclusive, talking about diverse range of values, and these are approaches that we do need to be working towards to really understand the full heritage values of the places we're managing. But just the story of the Alishan Forest Railway, and also the story of the sugar and tobacco farming in Taiwan. I think that those are illustrative because we need to ask ourselves, well, those aren't the whole story. What is the natural part of that story? For example, from where did the forest come that then was the resource that the cultural process of logging was taking advantage? And then there's a sort of transaction where you've got natural value, natural phenomena and cultural phenomena occurring in the same space. This is all part of the story. And then Professor Lin, I've been to your museum and I love it. It's a fantastic museum. And I think that the role that museums can play in actually, especially natural history museums, in demonstrating that an appreciation of natural heritage is itself a cultural concept or a cultural construct, that it's almost as if, maybe the museums of the 19th century had it right when they were just displaying natural phenomena in these cultural institutions, because it was forcing the visitor to appreciate natural heritage in a cultural way, if that makes some sense. But anyway, I just wanted to say in general, thank you very much for those wonderful presentations, and I look forward to hearing what else you have to say now.
OK， 谢谢。我想伊恩他在这里面扣紧了这个文化资产跟自然之间的关。
So Ian mentioned about the intersection of cultural and natural heritage and the importance of taking an inclusive and holistic view. Would any of the panelists like to respond? Hi, Ian. Thank you for your feedback. You talked about presenting a holistic story. Sometimes what we see is only part of the story, and there's still a large part of the iceberg that is under the surface. Sometimes we need to look at the whole story. For example, the natural element within cultural heritage and cultural element within a natural heritage or landscape. The research efforts in this field will be never ending. There will always be new researchers joining our task. So it would continue to evolve. I think that's what's interesting about heritage research. And I would like to invite you to come back to Taiwan again if you have a chance in the future. I would also like to comment. Ian had been to my museum. The National Taiwan Museum is the oldest museum in Taiwan. It was established by the Japanese during the colonial period. The Japanese government systematically collected natural artifacts, cultural artifacts, and using modern taxonomy to colonize the museum landscape as well. So it has a huge baggage that dates back to the colonial period. Over the past 100 years, the museum has collected a huge collection of specimens, artifacts. They are the embodiment of the progression of Taiwan, whether it's the urban landscape, natural cultural landscapes. The existence of the museum, the collection of the museum, in fact, have remained relatively unchanged, but the environment in which it operates has changed drastically. Therefore, we are constantly asking ourselves, are we reflecting, adapting to the changing environment? The cultural landscape in Taiwan demands a different approach and a reinterpretation of the Taiwan's cultural subjectivity, of the Taiwanese identity. So these are all the new missions of the National Taiwan Museum. I would also like to speak. Natural and cultural landscapes are inseparable. So from the Alisan Forest Railways office perspective, we have done a lot of research on the past 100 years of the evolution of the railway. We've launched a lot of educational programs. We have made an inventory and conserved the tangible and intangible heritage. And we also make use of the dynamic conservation approach, keeping the locomotives, keeping the rolling stock alive. So wherever you go on the landscape, It is part of the Ecological Outdoor Museum. Each and every staff member at the office is a vessel or the holder or the conservationist of the cultural heritage and our cultural legacy. Everyone plays a part. Thank you very much, Ms. Huang, for sharing your thoughts with us. In the interest of time, I would like to ask all of our speakers to join us in the group photo shooting session. We will ask our VIPs and Ian, we would like to ask you to join us for group photo shooting. So please remain online and look into your camera. We will ask the officials from the Cultural Heritage Bureau and the moderators, speakers, and presenters to please join us in group photo shooting. Okay, can you put your thumb up? We would like to take more photos. Can you put your thumb up? Thank you very much. We're about to take a few more photos. Now, let's show the yes sign, the victory sign, please. Can we show the victory sign? One more photo, please. Thank you. That concludes the photo shooting session. So Ian and those of you joining us online, officials from the Bureau of Cultural Heritage, Ministry of Culture, all the professors, experts, and heritage professionals, thank you very much for joining us today. We have reached the end of today's program. Please make sure you join us and sign up for another international workshop that will also be simultaneously translated on October 14th. With that, we conclude the Industrial Heritage Conference today. We hope to see you in Taiwan soon. Once again, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ian. Mr. Ian Travers, we thank you for overcoming the time differences to join us, and we hope to see you soon in Taiwan. Thank you, and that's all for today. Thank you.